I'm here today with Dr. Erica Rivera, who recently joined us as our managing partner and executive advisor. Erica has a long and very successful track record assessing and advising boards, CEOs, and C-suite leaders, CEO succession, board evaluation, and leadership, all of those within global fortune companies and private equity. Erica joins us from YSC, where she was the global director of their private equity practice. Earlier, she worked in senior roles at RHR International and GH Smart. Today, we'll spend a few minutes discussing scaling leadership, private equity trends, and the current environment for senior leaders. Erica, let's start with what's the current landscape for leadership assessments and development in private equity today?
It's interesting. You can look at it from two different perspectives. You can look at it from the perspective of what private equity firms are doing with their internal development of human capital. And then you can look at it in terms of what they're doing in the portfolio in developing key executives, their C-suite executives that they're relying on ultimately for value creation.
Has that trend changed over the past couple of years?
It has changed. It's changed in both areas. So from an internal development standpoint, more and more private equity firms have realized that operating margins aren't the only opportunity for value creation. And in fact, an even greater opportunity to create value in a business hinges upon who the executives are and how they are focused on key business priorities, how they hire the right people, how executive teams work together, how they are driving forward in goals, priorities, and etc. So that's the one side on portfolio management. And then in terms of internal human capital, moreover, large firms as well as some of the mid-cap firms are looking at developing in-house consulting teams, so to speak, right? And the in-house consulting team goes beyond your typical operating partner into various areas. Some could be in the digital and AI space, digital transformation. The other areas are in human capital, as well as for some industries, supply chain experts, etc. And so if you're building an in-house consulting team in a private equity firm, you're offering the portfolio company all of these incredible services to enable value creation and success. So your next question, Bill, is probably, so then how do you get there?
So how do you get there?
Right, exactly. So the beauty of businesses like ours is that we can come in to this catapulting of pushing value creation of businesses forward with a objective lens to identify whether PE firms are hiring the right talent internally to support their portfolio, as well as assessing and developing the talent within the actual portfolio companies.
So how are they fully utilizing executive and team coaching and development, both internally and also for their portfolio companies?
It's a good question, right? Because I want to say over the past, call it 7 years or so, assessment has become far more commonplace, which is fantastic for our business and the way we can impact and help catapult businesses forward. I think where there's still a great opportunity is in the what we call the so what, right? The what next. Because you can have a great assessment process and uncover real great opportunities to enhance executives' behavior and enhance the way they're leading an organization. But it is very hard on a day-to-day basis for an executive to monitor themselves and continue to focus on where their development opportunities are and honestly evaluate their own behavior day-to-day to see if they're advancing. So where our industry really comes in is in that so what. So what do you do about the data that you've uncovered? And that's where executive advisory, leadership capabilities, and leadership advisory coaching comes into play, not only for the individual, but for the team. It's an incredible thing to see an executive advance in their impact through self-awareness and understanding that they've gained through their assessments. It's another thing to really see an executive put their actionable development plan in place so that they have an even greater impact, are able to focus more on the business priorities, or are able to determine the business priorities and hire the right people to support the business. And that's where team effectiveness comes into play. With team effectiveness programs, you're really trying to get to the heart of what an executive team can do as a sum of different parts versus one executive alone. And as we all know, an entire team is the secret sauce to an organization, not one individual. And so, for example, let's say you were able to do a number of assessments across a full team. You can take that data from what you've garnered from a full executive team, understanding where their strengths are, where their gaps are, how the team can play on each other's strengths and gaps, fill in for one another, and then identify the what's next and how they go forward and lead a business, lead an organization, drive priorities, create action and impact in the business.
So that's the piece where what's next in PE comes into play.
Exactly, right? And the thing about PE is how fast things move, right? And so if you're coming in as an investor and you have a value creation plan that has a time frame of 1 to 3 years or 1 to 5 years, time frames for exits or changes have fluctuated over the years, but when you're looking at a finite time frame, for the most part, you really needed to get action quickly. So you bring in an executive, and Bill, as we know, onboarding executives, being new to an organization, it takes time to really get up to speed and get entrenched into the business, as well as create followership and action and energy in order to move a business forward. Right? And so then add a layer of PE in the time frame on top of that, you really have to hit the ground running. It's an understatement, right? You have to be able to hit the ground running and move fast while bringing others along with you. So what is better than knowing where the landmines are, knowing where one's own strengths are, knowing whom on their team to rely on for their own gaps, in order to really drive change or drive impact quickly. And that comes through both assessment as well as really coaching in the moment, real-time coaching on how to move a business forward and keep an eye out for one's own watch-outs.
And so what differentiator would PE firms be looking for in a provider?
Right. That's a great question. So PE firms look for providers who can quickly respond to their needs, right? Because decisions need to be made quickly in private equity as well as within their portfolio companies. And then PE firms are really looking for advisory partners that understand the differences between private equity and publicly backed companies. Right? And if you can speak the language of what it means to be a successful executive in private equity, then you're helping a PE firm to effectively evaluate their executives and who's going to land well, who's not going to land well. One of the things I always look at in using both assessments as well as a deep dive interview is how is an executive going to work with this private equity board? It's different than a public board. Right? Private equity boards tend to be more involved. They can meet monthly versus quarterly. There are executives, investors, and other appointees on the board who can call a CEO daily, if not a few times a day. Call a CFO daily, if not a few times a day. The CRO, etc. Public companies do not work that way. Right. And so you need an executive who really understands what it's like to work with a private equity board and how that's going to be for them versus working for a public company.
And so I know this is a generalization, but have the PE firms adjusted their competency models for senior executives and CEOs, given the pace of change? And I say broadly because there are different sectors that private equity work in, right, and different evolutions or states that their portfolio companies are in.
Yeah. I think global macro and microeconomic environmental changes have been pushing all businesses to move at a faster pace and more agile pace. But certainly with the pandemic over the past 4 years, that pace has been heightened. And I think that's lent itself in private equity to understanding the external factors that play into driving and leading a business, and then therefore leadership competencies. And so I think certainly private equity firms have always talked about having agile, fast-paced executives, but now having an agile, fast-paced executive who can deal with the challenges of supply chain, has a strong network of executives, has been around and seen different types of businesses and been able to flex and find creative solutions, who can manage the needs of having diverse work environments that reflect not only the world we live in, but often the customer base, the diversity of a customer base. I think over the past few years, we have seen real challenges in the workplace that have affected every single type of business, and private equity has responded to that.
In what ways would you say that, again, a broader generalization, are they ahead or behind the curve? And what would they see as a competitive advantage?
Yeah, I think private equity is ahead of the curve in being more thoughtful in creating their boards. So they have more flexibility, they have more options, they have sometimes a much broader network of executives to dig into, right? To identify in order to create a more diverse board than public companies have. So that's one way I think private equity is leading. Private equity has made commitments around hiring ethnically diverse, gender diverse, growth mindset diverse executives within their portfolio, as well as bringing that variety to the board. And they're able to do it. They're able to make those decisions for themselves and make them quickly. So I do believe they're ahead of the curve there and making headway in a much faster pace than public companies are.
You've talked a bit about pace and speed in decision making, and how do they know if they got it right or not?
Yeah. Well, so that's one place I think private equity can do some borrowing from the public sector space. Best practices in the public sector are to do an end of the year CEO evaluation, end of the year board self-evaluation. Obviously, not all boards do that, but it's a really nice cadence and measurement place to do it at the end of the year, to say, what did we get right? Where did we miss the mark based on, for private equity, what our value creation goals were? Based on the environment, what do we need to change? Based on how the business macroeconomic changes have been shifted over the year, what do we want to do going forward? And it becomes a bit of a nice reset button. We have one company where we worked with them throughout the year on really scaling the business, getting beyond that $1 billion mark, which is a hurdle in the private markets. And toward the end of the year, the board and the CEO said, let's really look back and think and evaluate what we got right and where we missed, because now our target next year in value creation is also double digit in space, right? And so we backed up and said, okay, let's do a CEO end of year evaluation where the CEO self-evaluates. In this case, it was himself. And then we do a full 360 stakeholder feedback evaluation that included the board as well as the executive leadership team and some C-1 executives to say, how did the CEO hit the mark and where are opportunities going forward given the business challenges where the CEO can do things differently or more? At the same time, the board said, well, if we're going to evaluate the CEO, let's evaluate ourselves, because the board's sole purpose is to support the CEO and the business. Really smart, really forward thinking, and the combination of that data from the CEO evaluation, both self-evaluation and stakeholder feedback evaluation, and the board's self-evaluation enable this business to say, we need a bit of a reset on where our priorities are and our goals are for the next year. It was an incredibly successful piece of work for them and enabled them to have a really strong strategy session come the fall. And so kind of end of summer, beginning of the fall is a great time to do CEO and board self-evaluations, and then sets that business up for their end of year strategy session moving into the next fiscal year.
Are there differences in assessment profiles or tendencies for portfolio executives versus Fortune global companies, such as stress indicators or motives or values?
Yeah. Look, we talk about this all the time, Bill, right? In Fortune 25 and the businesses we work with, Fortune 50s, executives need to be that much more savvy to speed, to being agile, right? To understanding constant shifts and challenges in business and trends. The same goes for private equity. Right? So private equity is always a business that worked fast. So they were always looking for agile executives who could drive speed to execution. There isn't a whole lot of time to meander about a strategy and an opportunity until you can just execute on that. That's where the fail fast concept came in technology. We hear that all the time. Now we hear less about fail fast and more about speed to execution. So you're looking for executives who have comfort with calculated risk taking, who are very much grounded in data and analytics, so they can calculate risk and take smart decisions, and then know when to stop, cut your losses, and back up or move forward. And that skill is one that I think is, bar none, very different from the speed at which your typical Fortune 100 company is able to move at, right? And I'm thinking an example of a company we're working with, one of the Fortune 50s we talked about last week. They have a pressure for speed to execution because of what the competition is doing, but they have more time. They have a good 2 quarters, 3 quarters, a year in order to make decisions and shift their strategy and their priorities. In private equity, you don't have a year to shift your strategy and adjust your priorities. You really need to do it more quickly.
I'm sure we could find examples of Fortune 50 companies that would say, Erica,
yeah,
our need of speed and changing, that's what we're focused on now in our leaders and in the ability to execute quickly.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. Everyone is looking for leaders who are agile and comfortable with a certain degree of risk taking. Minus, of course, some of the finance functions, the CFO, etc. Right? You want them to be far more strategic and conservative in their risk, but for certain, right, with our global economy, increasing competition, consolidation of industries, etc., you need a level of speed to execution. But having said that, in private equity, speed is at a much, much faster rate in terms of expectation than it is in public company environment. Right? And that's because the public company environment has a greater regulatory environment, right? And so they can't move as quickly for regulatory reasons in some instances, right? Or board involvement requirements for some reasons, where in private equity, you just have more flexibility there.
So PE is probably, correct me if I'm wrong, trying to adopt some of the discipline and governance that large public companies have. Large public companies are trying to have the agility and speed that PE firms have.
I think you're right. I think that's a great observation. I think there's something like, maybe this might have even been a couple of years old, something like 2,000 private equity firms right now, of all sizes, large, mid, small cap. But when we think about how the private markets have increased over the past 15, 20 years, it's inevitable that there's going to be less of a divide between the way a public company works versus the way private markets work.
You and I have talked a bit about the current environment of velocity and volume of change and disruption in business. I think best described by the term VUCA, which is velocity, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And actually, its origin is from the late 80s and the Army War College to describe the environment back then. How does this describe the challenges that this environment currently poses on leadership and leaders?
I think that it's amazing to think how far back that term dates, because it is so prevalent currently, right? Both in the private and public markets, speed and timeframes have shifted. Businesses need to be laser focused on priorities, cost measures, challenges in the workforce are prevalent everywhere we turn, right? Supply chain, etc. And then thus leadership competencies have shifted. I think if you look at the leadership competencies that were created in organizations, whether that's a private market or a public market environment, back 10 years ago, the competencies would be fairly different than they are today. When we create executive team charters or a competency model or scorecard for an executive, we typically say it has a shelf life of 2 to 3 years. I think historically we used to say it had a shelf life more of 4 to 5 years, right? And so we've had to respond in the way we advise our executives and our clients in the same way that they've had to respond to these volatile environments.
Given the environment we just talked about and described, what are some of Crenshaw's key differentiators to address the issues?
When it comes to coaching and advising executives, the effect and impact of the consultant, the advisor, is twofold. You want to impact behavioral change so that an executive shows up differently, engages differently, or in a steady, consistent way that they have been successfully doing in the past. But given the VUCA environment and the complexity of business today, it is essential, in my mind, that coaches and advisors really understand what it's like to be in a business and run a business. Right? They need that duality of understanding what it's like to be an operations leader, as well as what it's like to be a human being who needs to change their behavior. And one thing I think that's extraordinary about Crenshaw is how deep our advisors and our coaches have worked in a variety of businesses. They haven't just held one operating role or leadership role throughout their career. They've held multiple, and for some of our advisors and coaches, in multiple different industries. So grounding that advisory experience for an executive in real life business experience is an absolute differentiator.
So I always think about, have they sat in the seat of the executive, right? And while this environment is different than others, a lot of our coaches and advisors sat in the seat during the financial crisis,
right,
or other key changes and key disruptions.
Right. Yeah. I always say, so having been in business for years myself before going into the field of psychology, with coaches and advisors that I mentor or have worked together with as colleagues, I always think to myself, Well, that sounds like a great idea, but is it plausible? Is it doable? What's that experience going to be like for the executive, for the executive's team? Is there a realistic time frame that we're asking an executive to change their behavior in or change their model and approach in? What's realistic? What's practical? And behavior change is hard. We know that, right? Human beings don't like to change. We are the biggest disruptor typically to businesses. When we think about the past 4 to 5 years, sure, the pandemic disrupted our business environment, but human beings were the ones to have the biggest disruptions and be the biggest disruptors to the environment. And so when we as coaches and advisors offer advice and actionable ideas for impact, we need to make sure that they are practical. And there's no better way to evaluate practicality than having had real world business experience.
So Erica, even teams with great talent don't always optimize their effectiveness, especially in a highly competitive and disruptive environment that they're operating in. So how do we address this?
There's a few ways we're helping teams today. I think historically, while teams were pressured to, executive teams, direct reports of the CEO, were pressured to deliver to a business strategy and to business priorities, that pressure has only been heightened with the competition and the VUCA environment we've talked about at different times and today. And so what we can do with teams is really help them with an objective lens to understand where their gaps are. And we do that in a couple of ways. We do it by saying, hey, let's take a look at what the fundamental core style of everyone on this team is individually, and then help build and develop those team members to be even better leaders than they are. And then we can look at that team in aggregate as a powerful aggregate to collectively push and change and monitor and drive a strategic agenda, right? And so when you look at a team's data in aggregate, both their assessment data, quantitatively benchmarked against a global norm, and qualitatively based on their own experiences and their motives and their values, and you try and align both strengths and gaps so that they fill in for one another, you're also able to identify what their preferences are and where they might lean in one way versus another, measuring that again against their strategic priorities.
You know, it's interesting because even teams aren't static, right? There's some dynamic element to adding new members, transitions, change. And one of the greatest challenges I see of rising executives, particularly getting to the C-suite, is they need to now have an enterprise lens versus a functional, or they have to have both. Where they've been great at their function, now they have to support the CEO and the enterprise challenges and objectives.
Right, absolutely. That's a great point. And support one another, right? It used to be that sort of the corporate functions were the ones that had to be enterprise focused. But now in our competitive environment and the jockeying for operational capital, they really have to look at what is best for the enterprise and the business. And that's not always an easy muscle, right? It's the old what got you here won't get you there piece, right? You got to the position you're in as an executive because you did your expertise job really well. And now, I say this all the time with C-suite leaders. Look, they have fundamental knowledge that got them to the seat that they're in, but what is going to make them a successful C-suite leader is how they engage as an enterprise leader versus their core competencies, skills, expertise, and foundational knowledge. And that's a real shift for executives, number one. And it's also a shift, I thought this is where you're going to go as well, Bill, in how we onboard executives. Right? The data, it's amazing. It doesn't change. Something like 50% of executives fail in new roles. And it's not because they haven't been chosen based on their skills, their abilities, their competencies, their tenure, their emotional IQ. They could have been chosen perfectly, but onboarding to a new company and quickly getting up to speed in order to have an impact is as great today a challenge as it was 20 years ago, yet in a far more complex business environment.
Right. Both internally and externally, even folks from within.
Correct.
Right, have that different lens. So in terms of succession planning to the C-suite, if we could talk about that a minute.
Right.
Given that they need to move from or to a more enterprise lens and how they operate, what do we look for during the assessment process for succession planning?
We look for ability to scale. Right? So we look for one's ability to have a growth mindset, to be agile, to take on new skills, to think about new opportunities and differences and ways to learn. We look at organizational skills, both strategic thinking as well as strategic planning skill set. Right? We look at the ability to really double one's purview in size, space, sometimes globally, right, and in capacity. And so how can they really take the skills they have and 10x them to be an even more successful leader in a much larger role? And there's a number of different markers that we look for when we evaluate whether an executive is capable of scaling in role.
Given the succession planning that we just talked about, how do we best work with CHROs and enable them and work with them to make the best selection, as well as optimizing team effectiveness at the C-suite level?
So CHROs, right, Bill, they're always coming to us saying, how do we develop a strong pipeline so we can look internally for C-suite succession and eventual CEO succession versus externally, right? The preference is often internal versus external, only because it takes longer for an external C-suite leader to onboard than it does internal. Then there's a whole bunch of reasons around motivating employees, offering leadership development opportunities, employee engagement and culture, and et cetera. The complexity of layers that CHROs are dealing with today is really quite something. And as you know, we just had a couple of CHROs really come to us and say, help us develop our bench strength. And we've done that in a number of different ways, right? Most recently, we've got a couple of programs that really manage both the individual learning, coaching, and assessment component for high potential executives, as well as really highlighting how the senior leaders in an organization can support and work with high potential executives, not only in their domain area, but also across an entire business. So I think these robust programs that we've been putting into place most recently that are a year-long programs are a really nice complement to what CHROs are already doing internally in businesses to develop talent.
Along with developing bench strength, what other key priorities are CHROs working on?
I think it follows that this need for bench strength across all sectors and facets of a business obviously leads to that piece around the workplace flexibility and workplace of the future, right? You need to be able to have dedicated time to develop employees, to spend time, to see them in action, and et cetera. And so while everything we read out there today is around workplace flexibility and the challenges of work from home, et cetera, are about employee engagement and the talent acquisition challenges, they're also really about, to your point, developing talent for the future. And part of that is a back out from the shortened tenure in the C-suite. We've been seeing a trend in the length of time executives spend at that C-suite level getting shorter and shorter over years. I think the the average tenure now of a CEO sitting in role is about 5 years, right? Where we used to see something like 10 years was the norm.
Right.
And so there's an incredible pressure that CHROs are telling us about, right? They're coming to us to say, I need to do it faster. I need to be thinking about how I'm going to create my pipeline. I need to be thinking about a diverse pipeline as well as a ready now versus ready in 3 years versus ready in 5 years pipeline. So I think those are key areas that CHROs are typically coming to our types of businesses with, right? To where we work in the C-suite.
And so how are we working on CEO succession?
Yeah, one of the things I feel like we're continually saying is that CEO succession and overall C-suite succession is a journey, not an event. And there are a number of examples out there very recently in the past couple of years where CEO succession has not been successful and a CEO who moved to an executive chair role has had to move back in, right? Or a CEO is brought in from the outside typically or developed from within and then isn't the right fit and someone has to step down from the board. In our opinion, that's because effective timing was not taken into consideration in the CEO succession process. And that's a piece in our business that's continually evolving. I think CEO succession is still often thought about as something you need to plan for within a year or two. And what we recommend is anywhere from 5 to 7 years for a CEO succession planning pipeline, because you just don't know what's going to happen in that time period, right? And there are many examples recently out there of a planned CEO succession and the successor took a role elsewhere, right? Or something else happened that really disrupted the planning process. So we recommend having conversations around succession at a minimum 3 to 4 years prior than the expected change in tenure.
And how does optimizing that, what does that have to do with predicting where the company's going to be in 3 to 5 years, or how their business model may change, or what the disruptors are? What competencies are they going to need, or leadership competencies in 5 years that aren't necessarily critical today?
That brings up a great point, right? The reason to have objective CEO succession is simply, if nothing else, and there are many other reasons, but simply because boards and CEOs and C-suite tend to look at the sitting CEO as the template for the future CEO. And to your point, Bill, the business changes, the challenges change, the evolution in the landscape, the industry changes. And so the CEO that an organization needs tomorrow or next year or in 5 years is often far different from the CEO they needed in the past 5 years.
No real difference than what your workforce should look like.
Right, exactly, right. And so that begins our process. When we begin that conversation around CEO succession, that is exactly what we analyze. Where is the business going to be today? How do you anticipate the business changing? We interview board members, the ELT, the CEO, on what's going to need to shift based on industry environment, what the goals are for the business, what the strategy is, and then we back into that thinking about what competencies then are needed in a CEO for the future. And if a business properly plans out for CEO succession, they begin to identify who in the business could have some of those competencies and or gain exposure over 2 to 3 years to be better ready to potentially be CEO. So the sooner you begin that planning process, the better.
It seems to me that our ability, the industry's ability, but selfishly Crenshaw's ability to align and form the right partnerships with our customers are critically important for success.
Absolutely. And we have to do our homework, right? So, for example, I do a lot of work in CEO succession. Crenshaw does a lot of work in CEO succession. And I can't count the number of times I've been in all kinds of environments, social environments, business, industry events, where people don't talk about the Disney CEO succession challenges, right? And so when Bob Iger was stepping down from Disney, it was at a time post-COVID, or I should say sort of coming out of COVID, where Disney's greatest challenge is how the business had been hit in the park space, an enormous financial piece to the business during COVID. So it made sense, right, in the layoffs and furloughs and challenges in the parks, to bring in a parks person who was an expert in the parks to run the business. Does that make sense going forward? Is that indicative of how Disney has succeeded as a commercial and creative driver with franchises like Marvel over the years and the acquisition of the Fox assets? It's a difficult business to evaluate when you threw COVID and the shift in parks into the mix. So presumably they had a very strong CEO succession plan, but COVID changed everything. It was something like the parks had never been closed for one day in 50 years, and yet they were consecutively closed throughout COVID. So you just don't know what's going to happen. But a CEO succession process needs to be a process that is planned for the longevity versus an in-the-moment business challenge.